Now open to the floor for questions, and I'm sure hopefully they're all pent up, as I said earlier. So if you can just identify yourself, who you're directing the question to, and the organisation that you represent, that would be very helpful. I'm hoping that there are people in the room with roving microphones. I think we'll take maybe 3 or 4 questions, because I understand that this room is going to be used by another party immediately after us. Okay. I cannot believe this. Thank you.
Good afternoon all. Dr. Hassan is my name from Stima Sako. My question has to do with the discussion we've had today is about the global, the overall projects. I'm talking about the strategic on the larger scale. What are we doing in terms of ensuring that there's an impact in terms of this project, and specifically in terms of the last mile? That is in terms of, according to the retail end user who's going to benefit from it. I've not heard much about that discussion.
Very good. We'll try and take 3 or 4 and then, yeah, you have 2 over here.
Nima Nedeljkovic, Initiative for Global Development. I find interesting there's a lot of very good technical discussion solutions. We're dancing around the dirty words of PW, political will. He was heads of state after all that created the CBN, right? You'd almost want to say, what is your perspective going forward on this? Because much of the issues, the soft underlying issue is exactly that. Particularly the question, I think, for regional projects. I'd be interested as an ancien combattant at the bank, when we looked at regional development projects themselves, is there a thought to actually assigning a chunk of money towards projects that will be going only towards the regional ones, and let the projects then chase the money? But that would require then setting up that truly supranational authority, and that comes right back to my political will again. So that's the question.
Seeking first the political kingdom. Okay.
Thank you very much for putting together such an very interesting and knowledgeable panel. I think I'm coming from the side of trade and development, from an institution, Afrexim Bank, where our core priority has become intra-African trade and industrializations. So really promoting cross-border infrastructure is key to our government. And we heard a lot today about risk facing the continent. And my questions is, do we have any interdependency in the classification of this risk? And to what extent could actually addressing the issue of trade support infrastructure become a key component to the issue of macro stability and regulatory reform? So I think we talked about risk as independent component, but there may be some level of interdependency with implications for actually achieving what we are trying to do. The second question is more rhetorical. I think after the global financial crisis, we heard the German President Heinz Kohler saying that it would have been better off for the Germans to put their savings into African infrastructure than putting them into US subprime product. And are we actually putting too much emphasis on the risk dimensions and not so much on the opportunity side of infrastructure? And I say this because, quite frankly, and if you go back to the Chinese character, it's always often said that risk and opportunity are the same symbol in that character. So I think I would also like to hear from this panel the opportunity side of that coin to really balance it a little bit. Thank you.
Maybe I have one question for Hubert at the back.
one is working. Wilfried Sages from GIZ. Thanks for quoting my president. But I was thinking along the same lines. And it's a question to the rating agencies, basically. If you look what's happening, the Chinese are taking those risks. They have just financed a railway from Kenya through Uganda to Rwanda to the tune of $13.4 billion. So that is a regional project as far as I know. Do they assess risk differently, or do they look more at the opportunity side? I mean, we all know that the nature of the deals are not disclosed, but maybe some of the panels have more knowledge than I do. But yeah, is it really that we overvalue risks and don't look too much into the opportunities? And looking at the Chinese, what is the difference in their assessment as compared to the ratings that are done elsewhere? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's the 5th question. So, who would like to tackle the first question about is enough emphasis being placed on the retail end user? Jay?
Sure, I will. Look, I think when you look at power, there's 2 ways to look at it. One is availability, and then the other one is accessibility, which addresses the last mile. And availability is what drives economic growth, in that you can have more power available for industrialization where it's needed in cities, ports, etc. And I think that's key. Last mile, it's not an African problem, it's a problem everywhere. And I think that the view that has to be taken there is going to have to be done on a I would say, more creative basis. And I would argue you could look at mini grids, microgrids, individual solar capability through mobile payments, which is being done in Kenya and Tanzania. So if you think about it, it's almost a point of, you know, you've got the grid, what everybody talks to, which quite frankly in many African countries still needs to be upgraded and continue to be invested in, and that's really going to be through DFIs, because commercial banks will be very hard to touch that. And then you've got the generation, which is mostly can be financed externally. But if you think about the grid, think about for the last mile almost a virtual grid. And I would argue that technology today exists where you can take mobile payment systems, which have been put together now and very well tested over the last 8 years, 9 years, and sign up individual homes and or villages or small towns or a microgrid. So you can have a virtual grid, a microgrid related to a small hydro, et cetera, but those are going to be very difficult for most of this crowd, I would think, to finance. I think you're looking more at NGOs and things like that, because it's going to be hard. You know, the one number I heard, whether it's right or wrong, I don't know, but was it's $1,000 to hook up a home. So I mean, there aren't going to be a lot of running a big 765 kV line out to a lot of places isn't going to make a lot of economic sense. So I think it's got to be a balance on how that happens. And I think availability is the key, because that'll continue to grow the economy.
And then Amy, you can have a stab at this before we move on to the next question.
Okay, thank you very much. No, I think just to sort of add to what Jay has said, if you take, for example, transport, if you have a road network that actually joins a number of cities, big cities, they go through the rural areas to open it up. Take, for example, when they built the Enugu-Manfe Road. Enugu-Manfe Road opened up the whole of that Gobra axis, and those people call it the local people were able to benefit, either in terms of trade or otherwise. Also, when you're looking at transmission lines, typically you have the high tension transmission lines, and then sometimes they go to a substation. From the substation, people hook up. I know, for example, when I go home, my village, there's power 24 hours, but in the city, I always have cuts of power. But because there was a grid going through, the whole of that region has power. So there is always, whenever you do this infrastructure, even though it might not be overtly stated, there's always the user potential, because it's only the user that justifies the project.
Fantastic. And Mima's question was, what do you call it, the elephant in the room? Political will?
PW.
PW, there we go. Who would like to tackle that? Colleague at the AUB.
Yeah, thank you. Political will is there, and it's going to get even more and more. And this is demonstrated in many ways. We have the Presidential Infrastructure Champion Initiative, for example, which has selected as a pilot 8 or 9 regional projects which selected heads of state are championing. At the African Union Summit, twice every year they report progress. And we can see demonstrable progress on those projects because each head of state is held accountable for his own project. If it's not moving, it won't move. So he will unblock any political complexities or issues to make sure the project moves. That's just one example. And now we're getting even more countries wanting to join this initiative. So there are certain projects, I think it will vary from project to project, but at regional level you find that a project perhaps is led more by one country and the others are basically follow. You will have a project like the LAPSET in Kenya, the Lamu Port corridor, which is being developed, where a lot of perhaps potential investors would say, is it really viable? But it's moving ahead because the government and the leadership there is determined to make it happen. They're signing agreements with their partner member countries. So I think it's there. I mean, and it shouldn't really be an issue for projects that are really of high priority. And the second part of the question, if you allow me, was to do whether we could set up a regional pool of funds to support regional projects. There are some pools like that. I mean, we in the African Development Bank have got what we call a regional operations envelope. So basically for a regional project, we'll provide 2/3 of the financing as grant money, as long as the country commits 1/3 of the cost. So there must be agreements between the countries because it must involve 2 or more countries. And these are, for this moment, we're only providing this facility to low-income countries. So basically to encourage them, a carrot. If you agree to do the project, 2/3 of the resources will be financed by grant, 1/3 from your national allocation, from the ADF funds, which we provide. So.
Yes, I mean, on this issue of political will, I think as Jay mentioned, it's almost like being in opposition and then you win an election and you just want to complain about the government. So I think we've got, as the private sector, we're hearing on an unprecedented level, governments at the heads of state level, African Energy Leaders Group, a group of African presidents working with the private sector to try to get projects to financial close. CBN was called for by heads of state. We have a Presidential Infrastructure Champions initiative. The question really is, I suppose, who are the private sector interlocutors that can generate optimal efficiency through that engagement? And I think we need, as the private sector, to really think that, we need to understand that times have moved. And we're now in government as opposed to in opposition per se, excuse the political correctness of that. But I mean, we need to sort of evolve as the private sector, I think. I don't have the answers to that, but I do believe naturally that the CBN is a great platform to start because it's actually being requested by the heads of state. And the classification of risks and how that affects regional trade. Is there anyone that would like to touch on that? Are we overemphasizing the risks on the continent, Conrad?
I'd like to actually sort of come back to this example given the Chinese investment, for instance, in railways. I think we need to differentiate here. There are different dynamics we are looking at. There are different dynamics behind bilateral lending. There are different dynamics behind multilateral lending. There are different dynamics behind commercial. And that's also why we, as a rating agency, what we rate are commercial obligations. We would not rate bilateral obligations or MLIs obligations because the default dynamics are so different. And when you look at sort of default histories, you would see that countries first, not always, but most likely first default on their bilateral loans. Then commercial, then multilateral ones, because of preferred creditor status, you don't want to mess that up. And at the very end, only trade finance, because you don't want to cut yourself up off from importing whatever powdered milk from Nestle. So they're very different dynamics. And I think we need to recognize these dynamics. We cannot say because China or any other government is willing to provide bilateral loans, that they have a better understanding or different understanding of risk. They have different agenda. They have different objectives. And the point I also would like to make in this context, there must be space for all sorts of different lending. And ultimately, when it comes to bilateral, when it comes to DFIs, when it comes to MLIs, all their balance sheets are not going to be big enough to actually deal with the funding gap. And that's why you also need the private sector investment. And that brings us back then to a more conventional risk analysis.
Can I add something?
Yes, Mr. Olian.
Yes, just to not to echo what a bit Conrad said. For China, the fact that the strategy is a long-term strategy. The funds are concessional in nature, and there is often the need to secure some of the commodities and for the Chinese economy. So as he said, the motives are totally different than a pure private lending. Just to also go back to what kind of lender for infrastructure project in Africa, I think we can learn the lesson of elsewhere. When we look at the global spending on infrastructure project, most of the projects are funded by corporate infrastructure, like the Gs or others, not by project finance itself, or including PPPs. Corporate infrastructure represents 4 times in Europe, 6 times in North America, the amount that is financed through project funding. I think for Africa, it will be probably the opposite. Project-specific funded and PPPs, while probably more corporate infrastructure will be able to fund. When we look at the type of project China has financed at 13 billion, we understand clearly where the difficulty lies. $13 billion project in Africa is just too big. You take the MDBs, the DFIs, the underdeveloped local market, and the fact that they limited access to international capital market, and this kind of project are very, very difficult to finance. So it's only through attracting foreign investment and trying to create the framework that it will be solved.
Hubert, let me just
Linear and Jeff, then
let me just add something briefly. I think the nature of regional infrastructure basically is to link 1 or 2 countries or more together. Now the whole thing is to ease the flow of both capital and human capital across the region. Now you find out that this is always the issue, that when you can't have the free flow of that, then it inhibits your project happening. If you've taken a travel, say from Abidjan by road all the way to Lagos, you'll be able to experience what I'm saying. Because if you do that, there is capital. People who are willing to actually move things across and do things. But if they can't do that freely, then they actually almost like it constitutes a bottleneck for you to actually be able to move infrastructure across. So the political will, the harmonization is actually critical. Immediately we have that, you will see a dramatic change. And my colleague from Afro-Exim Bank can actually do more trade financing as he wishes.
Jeff, you have
2 small comments. I think first, you mentioned the continuity among governments, and I think for me in some countries it's really critical. So, and we are holding our breath when there are elections, and we're asking ourselves, will the next government, if there's a change, will they continue to support, or will they say there was fraud involved, it was the best interest of the countries, etc. And that really stops investments, and to some extent sometimes stops us from ensuring projects as well. Yeah. Second comment I would like to make, you have to make a difference between central governments and sub-sovereign risk. The TANESCOs, the ZESCOs, the SNEL in DRC, they're fundamentally very different risk from the government risk. And what we see is that many governments are now trying to push the responsibility for financing, etc., to these entities that fundamentally are very, very weak.
Thank you, Jeff. We have two very, very brief, not more than 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds, if I'm feeling generous, statements from the floor. One from our friend Kofi from the International Finance Corporation, who, as we know, the IFC has a number of great products in this space. Kofi, if you can identify yourself into the microphone. And I wonder if Ms. Shimada is in the room as well. Is Ms. Shimada from Toshiba in the room? Kofi, no? Kofi. Come here. It's working. It's not working. Do you have another mic?
Yeah, come right here.
That going to be upward?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
The floor comes to the
Maybe I can do without. Can you hear me?
No. They have to translate.
Okay. Yes. Thanks, Hubert. So yes, the IFC, actually the World Bank Group, does have guaranteed product for sovereign risk, and the same way Jeff described them, it works exactly in the same fashion. We have what we call the partial risk guarantee from the World Bank, which allows the government guarantee to be backstopped by the World Bank Group. And first, it's a partial guarantee, which means that only part of the total project cost are guaranteed. That provides motivation for the investors to continue, operate, and deliver. It also brings the World Bank Group into negotiation when there are issues with sovereign guarantees. On the investor side, they find already that the government risk is being somewhat balanced by a certain amount of money from the World Bank. Generally, I would say something around 1/3 or 1/4 of the total project cost, which have them be more secure about the bankability because part of the government risk is already mitigated. Finally, what I would say for governments, what is quite interesting, is that the partial risk guarantee amount is not the amount that goes on the balance sheet of the government. It's only 1/4 of that amount that goes onto the balance sheet. It makes a great difference because you can leverage much more the IDA envelope to guarantee projects and scale up the projects you want to guarantee. Thank you.
Thank you, Kofi. It's good to know. So we need to close up the session now. So I'm going to give a parting shot to all of our speakers, sort of 1 minute of closing remarks. I'm not going to influence them other than to ask them to specifically give 2 recommendations that could go into the CBN report that they're preparing for the heads of state meeting in July. So let's start with you, please, Admasuk. Closing remarks, then 2 key concrete recommendations that you feel that heads of state should champion to potentially de-risk regional infrastructure investments in the continent. Same question.
Keep it very simple. There's just 2 points. Ensure the incentives are right, taking into account all the issues that investors have to face. 1. You can, of course, reduce the incentives over time, but to build that momentum up, sweeten them up. That's the first one. The second one, reforms. Keep advancing reforms. We've done a lot of reforms that have paid us very well on the continent, but most of those reforms are at the macro level.
Which priority reforms?
Just, well, reforms in terms of, for instance, how PPAs are dealt with, in terms of capacity, or whether it's, the national treasuries or the ministries of energy, the link with the utilities, the reform of the utilities themselves, the unbundling of the sector, ensuring competence is actually given highest priority in terms of appointment of executives and management in those institutions. I think just those 2 points would add a lot.
Thank you very much. Walian?
As a rating agency, we don't give advice, but I think two elements I think that could be very helpful. I think stability is really important. So macroeconomic stability, it means a good public finance and a monetary policy. to anchor expectation. And the second element, I think, is to develop the local capital market. It's the only way to have long-term finance in local currency.
Thank you. To the point. Jay?
Yeah, I would echo what I said earlier, which is prioritization of projects with a thought around getting them done as quickly as possible. And that's got to be on both sides. If the government does push through, we as the private sector have to be able to also be available to push through our bureaucracies, et cetera, that we have as well. That would be one. And then I think on the other one, try to standardize. Work on standardizing PPAs, regulatory regimes as much as possible. It makes it a lot easier and a lot less lawyer costs if we could get that done.
Thank you. Jeff?
More or less the same as what said. Create a predictable legal and regulatory framework to address attract investments and improve the enforcement of the law. Second, especially in power, make your off-take risk smaller by improving and capitalizing utilities.
Thank you. Chua?
Well, rather difficult from where we sit because we work a lot with the governments, and it's more like the recommendations are from the private sector group 2 heads of state. But I think 2 issues that I would encourage, which basically talk to 2 points already made by Jeff and Jay, is about predictability of regulatory frameworks. And I did talk earlier about where possible to setting up multinational institutions to be given mandate to implement projects. This is a recommendation that would make, and in that way demonstrate at a very high level the political will issue. And secondly, it's really how to de-risk these priority projects by engaging further, I think through this platform like the CBN, perhaps sub-engagements with individual heads of state, with private sector investors on specific priority projects. That would really, I think, take those projects a step forward. In terms
So more bilaterals, is it?
More bilaterals, could be even broader than bilateral. But I mean, suppose if we had some heads of state here to talk about certain projects, and your potential investors sitting in the room, that kind of brings informality in the whole process and ensures, I think, the chances of getting the project to close.
Thank you. And Comrade, you're not allowed to use any comments from any of your previous colleagues. My little joke.
That's fine.
No, I'm only kidding. Please feel free.
No, what I wanted to mention is we recently did a survey talking to project sponsors and the industry as such. And the question really was, what needs to be done to attract private investment into the infrastructure space, into project finance? And the messages we got, and this is what I'm going to lay out here as part of my recommendation, to attract private investment into infrastructure, it can be achieved, and there were 4 points that always came up. One is improving incentives for institutional investors, and that could be through tax breaks. The way it was done in the US municipal market, which became a massive market, some people would say, well, it's a distortion there, but anyway. Then introduce mitigants like first loss tranches, liquidity facilities. The other point that was made, and that echoes one particular point that was made earlier, stable, predictable regulatory framework, or where you have regulatory hurdles, ease them somehow, get rid of them. The third point was, and I think that is a very important one, increased transparency surrounding funding plans and risk exposure, provide data. I mean, if you want analysts, if you want investors, look at your transactions, at your projects, they want reliable data, transparency and data. And the last point that was made, and that's a point that comes up a lot in conversation, build a successful pipeline of good projects. Because if you want investors to start putting their minds to project finance and infrastructure finance, that means they have to invest, they have to commit resources, they have to gain expertise. And if you just have a few odd projects and not
a well-staggered, consistent pipeline of good projects, who would do that? Who would commit? Who would make the commitment? So again, that's a very important point to me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Conrad, and thank you each and every single one of our panelists here. I mean, they've really taken us to task on some of these issues and really unpacked some of the complex details around the issue. I think we first must congratulate the CBN for convening such a panel of great and diverse minds. I think this is an illustration that the CBN is a convener. And it's also a validation that the private sector find it really useful to engage in a constructive way with the public sector leaders. So with that, please join me in giving a round of applause for both the panelists, the CBN and the sector. Thank you, everybody. Session closed. So, welcome. So we're now swiftly moving on to the closing remarks from Shamir, who is going to thank us all and invite us to lots of cocktails, I'm sure, hosted by the ADB.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.